Michael Jordan bets $100,000 on a coin flip with a stranger and loses. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. It was a warm night in Las Vegas, the kind of night that could easily slip into the blur of the city's neon lights and the perpetual hum of excitement that filled the air. Michael Jordan, already a living legend, had just wrapped up a high-profile appearance at a luxury hotel event. His presence commanded attention, not just because of his basketball career but because of who he was, the embodiment of success, discipline, and unrelenting will. To the public, Michael was a man of unimaginable achievement, whose every move was scrutinized and revered. But for once, Michael wasn't focused on the next game, the next endorsement, or the millions of people who worshipped his every move. This time, he was simply Michael, a man enjoying a night in one of the most famous cities in the world. Las Vegas, known for its thrill and unpredictability, had always been a place for people to test their luck. But tonight, luck would have its own plans for Michael Jordan, and it all started with a stranger's comment. It was a passing remark, nothing serious, from a man who had clearly had a bit too much to drink. The stranger, seeing Michael walk past with his entourage, blurted out, "I could beat you at anything." He laughed it off as a joke, but Michael, never one to back down from a challenge, wasn't about to let that slide. With a calm smile, Michael turned around and approached the man. "Anything, huh?" Michael asked, his voice carrying the weight of a challenge. "What do you want to bet?" The stranger, caught off guard but still confident, shrugged. "How about a coin toss? 100 grand on the flip." The air around them seemed to shift. A small crowd began to gather, the buzz of excitement slowly growing as more people took notice. Michael, known for his legendary competitive spirit, wasn't one to shy away from a bet. It didn't matter if it was basketball or a simple coin flip. To him, everything was a competition, a chance to test his resolve, to prove that no matter the odds, he would always come out on top. Without hesitation, Michael nodded. "All right, let's do it," he said. "But when I win, I'll take the 100 grand, no questions asked." The stranger didn't flinch. He laughed and shook Michael's hand. For him, the bet was the kind of gamble that you made when you didn't think it through. This wasn't just about winning, it was about the sheer absurdity of challenging one of the greatest athletes in the world to a game of chance. The crowd watched, waiting for something big to unfold. Michael didn't hesitate to make his move. He was used to pressure, the kind of pressure that came from the NBA Finals, the kind of pressure that shaped his entire career. But this wasn't a championship game, and the stakes weren't measured in points or titles. Instead, it was about pride, about the unspoken bond between two men in a city that thrived on the unpredictability of life. Jordan reached into his pocket, pulled out a coin, and tossed it in the air. The coin flipped once, twice, and then, with the softest of clinks, it landed. It was over. The crowd, who had been silently holding their breath, let out a collective gasp. Michael Jordan, the man who had crushed records and shattered expectations, had lost. The coin had landed the way it had, and there was no taking it back. In that moment, the world's most famous athlete stood in the center of the crowd, not as a victor, but as a man who had just lost $100,000 to a total stranger. The crowd was stunned. Some couldn't believe it, others were already pulling out their phones, ready to record the unthinkable event. Michael Jordan, with all his fame, his accolades, his championships, had just lost to a coin toss. The man who had won the bet stood there, looking as bewildered as anyone. This wasn't just a once-in-a-lifetime win. This was a bizarre turn of events that no one, least of all Michael, had expected. For Michael, losing wasn't something he was used to, let alone in such a public and unexpected way. He was a man who had built his career around an undefeated mentality. Every loss had been a lesson, but they had always been on his terms, in the context of basketball, something he understood. This coin toss, however, was a different beast altogether. It wasn't about skill, it wasn't about practice or preparation, it was pure chance. And for the first time in a long while, chance had turned its back on Michael Jordan. Yet, in that very moment, Michael did something that only a few truly understood. He didn't argue, he didn't try to reverse the decision, and most importantly, he didn't make excuses. He smiled, a bit ruefully, and pulled out the $100,000 from his wallet. "A deal's a deal," he said, handing the money over to the stranger. The crowd watched, a mix of disbelief and admiration, as Michael Jordan, the legend, stood in front of them, not as a figure of invincibility, but as a man who could handle loss with grace. The stranger, still processing the moment, took the money, but the gravity of the situation seemed to settle in. He had won, but he hadn't won on his terms. This wasn't the victory he'd expected. Michael Jordan had just handed him a victory, one that seemed to almost diminish the achievement. How could you really enjoy a win when it came at the expense of someone as iconic as Michael? There was no boasting, no pride in taking the money from him. For a moment, the stranger stood there, unsure of what to do with the life-changing windfall he had just been given. Michael could sense the hesitation in the air, but he didn't let it faze him. He had made the bet, and he had lost. That was the end of the story. The crowd had gathered around, some filming, others whispering among themselves, unsure whether to laugh or applaud. It was a strange mix of tension and awe. Michael, despite the odds, had managed to remain composed, and his dignity was intact. This moment, while bizarre and uncharacteristic of the man known for his never-give-up attitude, was just another chapter in his journey, a chapter that would be remembered, not for the loss itself, but for how he handled it. For Michael, there were no shortcuts to greatness. He had lost this bet, yes, but he had gained something too, proof that even the greatest of all time had to deal with the unpredictable twists and turns of life. In the aftermath of the coin flip, the hum of Las Vegas seemed to grow louder, more chaotic, as Michael Jordan stood among the crowd, processing what had just happened. He was used to winning, used to being the best. It was strange to him to lose, not just in front of a group of onlookers, but in a situation that seemed so trivial compared to the grand scale of his basketball career. Yet, there he was, facing a moment of defeat, and he didn't shy away from it. As the stranger, still in a state of shock, walked away with the money, Michael's eyes followed him for a moment before he turned and made his way back to the hotel lobby. His steps were measured, calm, though inside, a whirlwind of thoughts ran through his mind. He didn't regret the bet. He had made it for the sake of the challenge, the thrill of competition. But he knew that this was a rare occasion where he had not emerged victorious. It wasn't about the money, it was about the loss itself. For someone like Michael, who had built his career on the belief that success was always within his grasp, this was a test of his mental fortitude. The hotel lobby was filled with a mixture of people, some dressed in high-end clothes, others more casually attired. It wasn't unusual for celebrities like Michael to be in such places, but today was different. There was no entourage surrounding him, no basketball fans clamoring for autographs or selfies. There was only the quiet hum of background conversations and the subtle yet undeniable sense of intrigue about the man who had just lost $100,000 on a coin toss. As Michael moved through the lobby, he could feel the eyes on him. He was used to being the center of attention, but not like this. People often saw him as untouchable, an icon, a larger-than-life figure who seemed to never falter. But here, in this moment, he was a man like any other, facing a rare but real loss. He wasn't sure how people would view him now. Would they still see the same Jordan, the man who had led the Chicago Bulls to 6 NBA championships? Or would this moment of vulnerability overshadow everything else? In his hotel room later that night, Michael sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the ceiling. He replayed the coin flip in his mind, over and over again. It was almost surreal. He had put himself in a position where his legendary status meant nothing. It was just him, the coin, and a stranger. No basketball skills, no quick thinking, no strategy, just pure chance. It wasn't something Michael could control, and that was the hardest part. He had been trained for years to seize control of every situation, to outwork his opponents, to never back down from any challenge. But this wasn't a game of skill, this was just a game of luck, and luck had turned against him. He thought back to the countless games he had played in his career. There had been moments of failure, of course, games where he didn't perform up to his standard, games where he came up short. But even in those moments, there was always a reason. Whether it was a bad call, a missed shot, or just a tough opponent, there was always something that could explain the loss. This time, there was nothing. Just a coin flip. A simple, arbitrary twist of fate. Michael stood up, walking over to the window that overlooked the dazzling lights of Las Vegas. The city was alive, bustling with energy, the perfect backdrop for someone like him who had lived in the spotlight for so long. But this moment was different. He wasn't just looking at the city from a distance, he was reflecting on his own place in it. In a world where everything he did was scrutinized, where every victory was met with cheers and every defeat was seen as an anomaly, how did he reconcile this loss? He had always believed that greatness was within his control, that he could influence the outcome of every game, every situation. But now, standing alone in his room, he was forced to confront the truth that sometimes, even the greatest players don't get to control the outcome. The next day, the media circus began. The story of Michael Jordan losing $100,000 on a coin flip quickly made headlines, and the world reacted as they always did when something unexpected happened to a legend. Journalists lined up outside the hotel, eager for a statement, eager for Michael to address the loss. They wanted drama, a scandal, anything that could feed the insatiable appetite of the press. Michael, however, kept his distance. He knew what they were after, and he wasn't interested in feeding into the frenzy. Instead, he spent the day out of sight, choosing not to engage. He didn't need to explain himself to anyone. His career, his achievements, spoke for themselves. The loss was a fleeting moment, one that would fade into the past just as quickly as it had occurred. What mattered, he knew, was how he moved forward. Still, the media wouldn't let it go. Rumors began to circulate, and social media lit up with memes and jokes about the $100,000 coin flip. People began to question his legacy. How could someone who was so competitive, so relentless, lose to something so random? The irony of it all wasn't lost on anyone. Michael Jordan, the man who had conquered basketball, had been bested by a coin. But as the days passed, Michael didn't spend time dwelling on the public's reaction. He had been through worse before. He had dealt with critics, doubters, and moments of failure. What mattered to him wasn't how the world saw this loss, but how he would respond to it. In the end, this would be just another chapter in the story of Michael Jordan, a chapter that didn't define him, but rather tested his resilience. On the court, when the stakes were high, Michael was untouchable. He had a way of rising to the occasion, of pushing past every obstacle, every challenge, until the game was his. And he would bring that same mentality to this. He didn't need the approval of the public. What mattered most was his own sense of purpose, his commitment to being the best, and the knowledge that his legacy wasn't built on one loss but on the totality of his career. The days following the coin flip saw a shift in the media's tone. The jokes and mockery gave way to a new kind of respect. People began to talk less about the $100,000 and more about how Michael handled it. They realized that the true measure of greatness wasn't in avoiding loss, but in how one dealt with it. Michael had faced a moment of vulnerability, of unexpected defeat, and yet he had walked away from it with dignity. The public, initially eager to tear him down, now found themselves respecting him more than ever. And so, as Michael Jordan moved forward, the coin flip loss became just a small footnote in the story of his life. It was a moment, yes, but it didn't define him. What defined him was his ability to persevere, to never allow a single defeat, no matter how public or embarrassing, to shake his belief in his own greatness. In the end, it was just another reminder that even the greatest players in history had to face the unpredictable twists of fate. But Michael Jordan, as always, was ready to rise above them. The days after the coin toss were quiet for Michael Jordan, but the world was still buzzing with the story. It had taken on a life of its own. People were talking about the legendary Michael Jordan, the man who had achieved everything and yet lost $100,000 in a bet on a simple coin flip. As the weeks went by, the initial shock began to fade, but the headlines and social media memes remained, each one more absurd than the last. People in the streets joked about it, and late-night talk shows had a field day with the incident. It seemed like the world just couldn't get enough of the spectacle, this strange moment in a life full of triumphs. But Michael wasn't focused on the public reaction. He knew this would pass. It was a fleeting moment, one that would eventually fade into the background as the next big story came along. The world's fascination with his loss only reinforced a simple truth: people loved a good story about a legend falling from grace, no matter how brief or insignificant that fall was. But for Michael, this wasn't about the spectacle. This was about the quiet moments that no one saw, the decisions he made when no one was watching. In the days that followed, Michael returned to his regular routine. He was still involved in the business side of his empire, working on deals and endorsements that would continue to solidify his legacy outside of basketball. But the loss, however public, didn't linger in his mind. For him, the real test came not in the coin flip or the aftermath, but in how he would move forward. The thing about being Michael Jordan was that the expectations were always sky high. People didn't just want to see him win, they wanted to see him win in every possible way, in every facet of his life. If he lost, they expected him to come back stronger, to never show any weakness. That was part of the mythology he had built over the years, and it was part of the reason why the coin toss had become such a sensation. It was the rare crack in the armor, the one moment when Michael Jordan had been brought down by something completely out of his control. But as the media circus slowly wound down, the story began to shift. The same reporters who had gleefully reported on his loss now began to praise his response to it. They couldn't help but acknowledge that he had done something rare. He had accepted defeat with the same poise and dignity that had marked his career. Michael Jordan had shown the world that even when he lost, he would do so on his terms. There was no public tantrum, no outburst, no attempt to spin the story. He had simply taken it and moved on. That was what separated Michael from other athletes, other legends in history. It wasn't just about winning, it was about how you handled yourself in the face of adversity, how you carried the weight of the world and still managed to be yourself. He had made the bet. He had lost the bet. And rather than allow it to undermine his legacy, he used it to reinforce it. It wasn't about the money or the bet itself, it was about proving that he was untouchable not because he always won, but because he could lose and still stand tall. The months passed, and the incident became less of a headline and more of a story that people talked about in passing. A few memes here, a few jokes there, but nothing that could dent the legacy Michael had built. People had moved on to the next big story, and Jordan was once again the man who dominated everything he touched. He was still the greatest, still the icon, still the man who had redefined what it meant to be a champion. But that one coin flip remained a reminder for Michael. It wasn't a reminder of failure or loss, but a reminder of the unpredictability of life. In many ways, the coin toss had been a humbling experience, but not in the way most people would think. It wasn't about being humbled by the defeat itself, it was about understanding that life could throw curveballs at any moment, no matter how much you thought you were in control. It was a moment of clarity, a reminder that no matter how hard you worked, no matter how much you prepared, sometimes things just didn't go your way. And that was okay. One evening, months after the bet, Michael was sitting in his office, looking over business proposals. A few of his closest friends and colleagues were present, discussing a new venture he was planning. The conversation flowed easily, as it always did, but one of them, a longtime friend who had been with him through thick and thin, casually mentioned the coin flip in passing. "You know," his friend said with a laugh, "people still talk about that bet. They say you lost to a coin toss, but the thing is, you came out of it looking even better than before." Michael looked up, his expression calm but thoughtful. It wasn't the first time he had heard something like that, but it resonated with him in that moment. He didn't need to prove anything to anyone anymore. He had built a life and a legacy that was untouchable. His career, his reputation, was something that no single event could define. "That's the thing," Michael said, leaning back in his chair. "People want to see you win, but they also want to see you lose. And when you lose, they want to see how you handle it. In the end, it's not about winning every time. It's about staying true to yourself when things don't go your way." His words hung in the air, resonating with everyone in the room. It was a rare insight into the mind of one of the most competitive men on the planet. Michael had spent his entire life perfecting his craft, pushing himself to be the best. But now, at this stage in his life, he had come to realize that true greatness wasn't about never losing, it was about handling the losses with grace, maintaining the same strength and resilience when things didn't go as planned. It was that mindset that had carried him through the toughest moments of his career, the games where victory seemed impossible, the failures, the injuries. Each time he had fallen, he had risen again, not because of his ability to overcome defeat, but because of how he carried himself in the face of it. As he sat there, in that moment, Michael felt a quiet sense of peace. The world had moved on from the coin toss, but for him, it had been a turning point. He had faced a challenge that he couldn't control, and he had lost. But he had come out of it stronger, more resolute than ever before. In the end, it was not the coin flip that defined Michael Jordan. It was how he responded to it. He had shown the world that greatness wasn't just about winning, it was about facing adversity with the same level of commitment and poise that you showed when you were on top. And that, Michael realized, was the true measure of success. The story of the coin toss would fade from the headlines, but for Michael Jordan, the lesson would stay with him forever. It wasn't about the money or the bet, it was about the strength to move forward, no matter what. And that was the legacy he would leave behind. After the coin toss in Las Vegas, the press circus had quieted, but the public's fascination with the moment lingered. Michael Jordan, always the subject of scrutiny, found himself in a position he wasn't used to, being questioned about a loss. The very essence of his persona had been built around winning, around dominating every opponent that dared to challenge him. To lose, especially in such an unexpected and trivial way, felt like something the world couldn't help but latch onto. It wasn't the amount of money, it wasn't the bet itself, it was the rare crack in the armor of a man who had, for years, been synonymous with invincibility. Yet, Michael Jordan didn't shy away from the aftermath. The media did what it always did, fueled the fire. But Michael, despite the pressure, never allowed the loss to define him. To him, this wasn't a story of weakness or vulnerability. This was simply a small, inconsequential moment in a much larger narrative of a career that had redefined what greatness meant in the world of sports. For weeks, the memes and jokes about the coin toss flooded social media. Fans, sports analysts, and even comedians had their say. The irony was rich. Michael Jordan, the man who had made history with every game he played, who had risen from obscurity to the pinnacle of basketball, had lost a bet. But to Michael, that wasn't the point. What struck him most was how easily people were quick to assign meaning to a moment that was, in his eyes, simply one moment. In a world that loved to build legends and then tear them down just as quickly, Michael had learned that nothing was ever as important as people made it out to be. The media, the critics, and the fans, they were all distractions. What mattered, Michael knew, was how he reacted to those distractions. In the end, it was not the coin toss or the loss that mattered, it was the lessons learned along the way and the resilience to bounce back when things didn't go as planned. The weeks following the bet became a period of reflection for Michael. He hadn't given up the game of basketball completely, but his involvement in the sport was now different. He was transitioning from the court to business, to ownership, to legacy. He had always known that his career wouldn't last forever, but this moment, this odd little blip on his radar, made him more certain of that truth. He was no longer the 20-something-year-old who was trying to prove himself to the world. He was older, wiser, and more aware of how fleeting success could be. The coin toss, in its own way, had reminded him of that. Jordan's role in the world had shifted. He wasn't just an athlete anymore, he was a mogul, a cultural icon, a man who had built a business empire. His Air Jordan brand was now as synonymous with him as his basketball achievements. He could step off the court and still command attention, still shape trends, still impact lives. But as time passed, Michael began to focus more on legacy than on keeping his name in the public eye. The question he started asking himself was simple: what do I want to leave behind? The bet had done something unexpected. It had forced him to evaluate his own legacy. The sports world had already given him accolades: 6 NBA championships, 5 MVP awards, countless highlights, and an indelible mark on the culture of basketball. Yet, there was something about that one $100,000 bet that pushed him to think beyond trophies and titles. The loss made him aware of the human side of his journey. It reminded him that, no matter how many championships you won, how many records you set, how much money you made, life was still full of unpredictability. It was that unpredictability, that very element of surprise, that could alter everything. With this in mind, Michael shifted his focus. The money from the bet had long been forgotten. What remained was the sense of personal growth and the realization that, despite his public image as the ultimate winner, he was still a man who had to navigate life's uncertainties like anyone else. The coin flip, and its randomness, had served as a powerful reminder of that. In the months that followed, the story about the bet began to fade. The public moved on to the next scandal, the next big headline. Michael continued his life, moving between business meetings, family time, and the occasional public appearance. Yet, the ripple effects of the incident stayed with him. It made him reconsider how he presented himself to the world, how the public's perception of him shaped his every move. He had been living in a fishbowl for so long, constantly under the microscope, that it took a moment like the coin flip to remind him that life was more than just how others viewed you. One evening, sitting with his family in his private residence, Michael reflected on his career. He had achieved everything a basketball player could hope for and more. The rings, the accolades, the fame, they were all a part of his story. But as he looked at his children, he realized what mattered most now wasn't what he had accomplished on the court. It was what he was teaching them. The legacy he was building for them would be far more important than any individual accolade he had earned. He wanted them to learn from his life, not just from his successes, but from the failures too. From the moments when things didn't go right. The coin toss, it seemed, had brought him back to the essence of what it meant to be human. He wasn't perfect, and neither were his experiences. It was easy to look at Michael Jordan and think of him as an infallible figure. But in truth, he had faced his share of defeats, some more public than others, and each time, he had learned and grown. The bet wasn't just a moment of defeat, it was a lesson in resilience, in accepting the things you can't control, and in embracing the moments of vulnerability that come with being human. As Michael looked back on his career, he didn't see the bet as a blemish on his legacy. Instead, it was part of a bigger picture, a story that was far from finished. He had built an empire, not just in basketball, but in life. And as the years went by, he would continue to shape his narrative, not just with his successes, but with his ability to face challenges head-on, to accept the losses, and to keep moving forward with the same determination that had made him great in the first place. The story of the coin toss was nothing more than a moment in time, a moment that had come and gone, but one that Michael would look back on as a reminder that no matter how much you win, life will always have its way of keeping you grounded. And for Michael Jordan, that grounding was a part of the journey, not the destination. He had learned the value of staying true to himself, no matter the outcome. And that, more than anything, would be the legacy he left behind. As the months passed, the incident in Las Vegas seemed like a distant memory to most, but for Michael Jordan, the lesson it imparted remained a part of his daily thoughts. He continued to move forward with his business ventures, family life, and personal pursuits, but something about the $100,000 bet and its aftermath had shifted his mindset. He had always prided himself on his ability to control outcomes, whether it was in a basketball game, a business deal, or a personal challenge. Losing to a coin toss had shown him the limits of control, and that realization wasn't something he could easily shake off. Though the media had quickly moved on to the next story, Michael remained somewhat reflective about the public's reaction to his loss. In a way, it had humanized him. The world had always seen him as an unstoppable force, someone who didn't just excel but dominated. For years, he had been synonymous with greatness, and even his most ardent critics had to acknowledge that his record was unmatched. The coin toss, in its simplicity, had served as a reminder that even the greatest athletes could face situations beyond their control. Yet, rather than retreat from this humbling experience, Michael had decided to embrace it, internalizing the lesson that not everything was within his grasp. As he navigated his post-basketball career, this perspective had changed the way he interacted with his business ventures. No longer was it just about winning for the sake of winning. Now, he sought fulfillment and understanding in the process itself. His Jordan brand had grown into a billion-dollar empire, But Michael began to take more time to ensure that his legacy wasn't just defined by his financial success. He began focusing more on the people around him, ensuring his influence extended beyond the basketball court and into the communities he had once called home. For the first time in years, Michael felt a sense of peace that didn't come from a championship ring or an endorsement deal. It came from knowing that he didn't have to be perfect, and that perfection itself was often an illusion. This realization, however, wasn't immediate. The process of embracing it was gradual, marked by moments of introspection, conversations with friends and family, and the quiet reflection that came with age. He had always been a perfectionist, and the desire to be the best had driven him to push himself harder than anyone else. Whether it was during the long practices with the Bulls or during his time in the gym after retiring, the idea of never being enough had motivated him to improve every day. But now, after the coin flip incident, that mindset started to evolve. Michael came to understand that the pressure he placed on himself didn't have to come from an external place, it could come from within. He didn't need to prove anything to the world. He had already done that. Now, he had to prove something to himself, that he could handle the unpredictability of life with the same grace he had handled his victories. The realization didn't come without challenges. Despite his newfound perspective, Michael still carried the burden of expectation, both from himself and others. The world had always seen him as a winner, and while he had come to terms with the fact that some things were beyond his control, there were still moments when he felt the pressure to uphold that image. It wasn't easy to shift the narrative that had followed him throughout his career, the narrative of invincibility. But as time passed, the man who had once thrived on external validation began to place more value on his internal peace. His relationship with his family also deepened during this period. Michael had always been a fiercely dedicated father, but his focus on his children's well-being increased in the wake of the Las Vegas incident. He began to invest more time in their lives, ensuring that they understood the value of hard work, but also the importance of humility and resilience in the face of adversity. He wasn't just teaching them about basketball or business. He was teaching them about life, the lessons he had learned from both his victories and his losses. The media, on the other hand, continued to float between fascination and skepticism when it came to Michael Jordan. In the years after the coin flip, journalists began to notice a shift in how Michael approached interviews, appearances, and even public events. He wasn't as guarded, wasn't as eager to protect the image of the perfect athlete. Instead, he spoke more openly about his experiences, his doubts, and his vulnerabilities. While still maintaining the mystique that came with being Michael Jordan, he allowed a little more of the man behind the legend to show through. This change was most evident in his interviews and public statements. He began to talk more about the realities of competition, about how there were days when things didn't go as planned, and how he had learned to deal with those moments. He spoke less about his iconic victories and more about the struggles, the doubts, and the failures that had shaped him. It was a departure from the Michael Jordan people had once known, the man who was always on top, always in control. Instead, he became a figure who was more human, more relatable, and more approachable. At the same time, he continued to support the causes that were important to him. His philanthropic work became an even more significant part of his life. Michael was known for his charitable donations, but now, he became more hands-on, visiting the communities he supported, getting involved in the projects, and meeting the people whose lives his donations impacted. It was clear that, for Michael, the satisfaction of helping others had begun to outweigh the allure of adding to his personal wealth. His legacy was no longer tied solely to his athletic achievements but to the ways in which he used his platform to give back. His involvement in youth programs, scholarships, and charitable foundations took on a new dimension. He used his story, his rise from a small-town kid to a global superstar, not just as an inspiration, but as a tool to connect with those who faced similar struggles. The idea of legacy, he realized, wasn't just about what you achieved during your career, it was about how you impacted the lives of others after the game was over. Michael's business endeavors also flourished during this time. His ownership of the Charlotte Hornets had allowed him to take on a new challenge, one that required him to apply the same principles that had made him successful on the court to a different arena. As an owner, he had to navigate the complexities of team dynamics, business strategies, and public relations, skills that were foreign to him at first but that he quickly adapted to. He had long since moved beyond being just a player. Now, he was shaping the future of the game in a new capacity. Despite all his business success, his life outside the spotlight was where he found the most peace. His family, his friends, and the people he trusted became the center of his world. The loss of $100,000 in Las Vegas, which had seemed so significant at the time, was now just a small blip in the rearview mirror of a life that had been anything but ordinary. As Michael Jordan grew older, he began to reflect more on the bigger picture, the legacy he would leave behind. He understood that his impact would be defined not just by the championships, the endorsements, or the cultural phenomena he had created. It would be defined by how he had navigated the challenges of life, how he had used his platform to help others, and how he had dealt with the inevitable ups and downs of his extraordinary journey. The coin toss, in the end, had served its purpose. It had reminded him that control was an illusion, that life could throw curveballs at any moment, and that no matter how hard you worked, no matter how many victories you racked up, some things would always be out of your hands. But what mattered, Michael realized, was how you responded. And for him, the response was simple: keep moving forward, learn from every experience, and continue to live with the same fire and determination that had made him great in the first place. As the years passed after the infamous coin toss, Michael Jordan's life began to take on a different rhythm. The frenzy around the bet had long since faded from the headlines, but the internal transformation it sparked remained a crucial part of his ongoing journey. The basketball courts where he had once dominated had been replaced by business meetings and boardrooms. The man who had defined a generation of sports fans with his competitive fire now found himself thinking about his legacy, not just in terms of basketball, but in terms of life. When he was playing, Michael's whole identity had been tied to winning. Every victory, every title was not just a testament to his skills but a symbol of his personal drive and ambition. Now, in a new phase of life, Michael was realizing that winning in business, in life, and even in personal relationships didn't always follow the same rules. The lessons he had learned through basketball, the focus, the resilience, the refusal to give up, were still guiding him, but he was applying them in ways he hadn't expected. Despite his transformation into a businessman and philanthropist, there were still moments when Michael could feel the weight of his former persona, the pressure to be perfect, to always be the best. His reputation had been built on an idea of invincibility, of never backing down from a challenge, of pushing himself and those around him beyond limits. And yet, the reality of growing older, of stepping away from the game, had brought with it a sense of vulnerability that was both humbling and necessary. For years, he had placed everything on the idea that control was key, that by mastering his craft, he could control outcomes. This notion had served him well on the basketball court, but the loss of the $100,000 coin toss had shown him how little control he actually had in life. A coin flip, an event so arbitrary and random, had taught him a lesson that no opponent ever could. There were things outside of his control, no matter how prepared he was, no matter how hard he worked. This realization did not, however, shake his foundation. It solidified it. Michael had learned how to embrace failure in a way he never had before. He had always seen failure as an opportunity to work harder, but this was different. The coin toss wasn't something to be outworked or outplayed. It was just life being unpredictable, and in that moment, Michael had to accept it. He had to accept that not everything in life could be controlled, and that was okay. The way he had handled the loss, the way he had simply accepted the outcome with grace, had made him more human in the eyes of the world, and more at peace with himself. In the years following his departure from the court, Michael had taken on a new challenge, the ownership of the Charlotte Hornets. This was a different kind of competition, one that required patience, strategy, and a deep understanding of the game from a different perspective. While he had once been a player with a singular focus, winning championships, now, he had to think about the long-term success of a team, the impact of every decision on the players, the coaching staff, and the city itself. It was a far cry from the intensity of a buzzer beater, but it was every bit as important. The Hornets were a work in progress. The team had potential, but it lacked the kind of championship pedigree that Michael was used to. As an owner, he could not simply take over the game and make every shot. His influence was more indirect now, though no less vital. He found himself more involved in the development of young players and mentoring them not just on the game but on the mindset that had taken him to the top. The same principles he had lived by as a player, work hard, outlast the competition, maintain focus, were now the foundation of his role as an owner. Michael's approach to ownership was not without its challenges. The expectations placed on him were different, but still intense. Fans saw the name Michael Jordan on the team's roster, and they expected greatness. But unlike when he was a player, he couldn't simply will the team to victory. He had to build something sustainable. There were moments of frustration, moments when it felt like the Hornets were too far from success to make it worth the effort. But then he remembered, it wasn't about the immediate payoff. It was about building a legacy that would last long after the games were played and the championships were won. The work he did with the Hornets was about much more than basketball. It was about legacy, about teaching the next generation of players what it meant to be great, not just in the game, but in life. Michael often thought about the lessons he wanted to pass on, especially to the young players who looked up to him. He had been the youngest player on the Bulls when he joined the team, and now, as an owner, he was the mentor. He worked tirelessly to make sure that the players on his team understood the value of hard work, the importance of staying grounded, and the responsibility that came with being a professional athlete. He found fulfillment in these quieter moments. He wasn't competing for himself anymore, he was competing for the future of the team, for the future of the sport. He was still driven by the desire to win, but it was no longer the same kind of urgency. The stakes were still high, but they had evolved into something different. It wasn't just about him proving he was the best, it was about him helping others understand what it meant to be great. Meanwhile, Michael's philanthropic efforts continued to expand. He had always been a private philanthropist, giving generously to causes that were close to his heart. But in the years following his transition away from the court, he became more involved in his charitable endeavors. He established scholarships, built schools, and provided opportunities for young people from underserved communities. He wanted to show the world that greatness wasn't just about the things you achieved for yourself, it was about the impact you had on others. Through his foundations and initiatives, Michael began to reach a broader audience than ever before. He wasn't just a basketball legend anymore. He was a man who had learned from his experiences and was using that knowledge to make the world a better place. His story was no longer just about what he had done on the court, it was about how he had used his success to give back to others. And while the coin toss in Las Vegas remained a symbol of the randomness of life, it had become something else in Michael's mind, a reminder that there was more to success than just winning. It was about handling the losses, the setbacks, and the challenges with the same grace and dignity that had defined his career. The loss of that $100,000 was a turning point, not because of the money or the bet, but because it marked the moment when Michael Jordan learned that even in defeat, there was strength. Years later, when he looked back on that day in Las Vegas, Michael didn't see it as a failure. He saw it as a moment of growth, one that taught him the value of humility, the importance of resilience, and the need to embrace life's unpredictability. And when people asked him about the coin toss, he simply smiled, knowing that it had, in its own way, made him better, not just as an athlete, but as a man. In the years following the infamous coin toss, Michael Jordan's life continued to evolve in ways he hadn't anticipated. The media, as always, was eager to latch onto the next big story, but Michael had long since learned how to ignore the noise. The noise about the bet had died down, but something inside him had changed. The bet, and his acceptance of the loss, had provided him with a perspective shift that he had never expected. It wasn't about the money, or even the public spectacle. It was about learning to accept the unpredictable nature of life and realizing that it was okay not to be in control of everything. As the world moved on to new headlines, Michael found himself more focused on the people who mattered most to him, his family, his team, and his community. His life outside the spotlight had grown in significance, and he found that, despite all his wealth and fame, the most important thing to him now was the legacy he would leave for his children and the impact he could have on the world. The time spent away from basketball had allowed Michael to step back and reflect on his role in the sport, his impact on the culture, and how he could continue to influence the game from a different perspective. He had transitioned from being a player to an owner, and with his stake in the Charlotte Hornets, Michael began to see the game of basketball through a new lens. As an owner, he wasn't the one putting up 40 points a game or making buzzer beaters. He wasn't in the locker room strategizing with the team, but he was still very much involved in shaping the future of the sport. Owning a team gave Michael a sense of purpose, but it also came with its own set of challenges. There were difficult decisions to be made, both on and off the court. Michael's competitive fire never dulled, and now he was using it to build something sustainable. The Hornets were far from being an elite team, but Michael was committed to making them contenders. He was building from the ground up, focusing not just on winning, but on creating a culture of excellence that would last long after his involvement in the franchise. He became more involved in mentoring the players, using his vast experience to guide them both on and off the court. But it wasn't about telling them how to play, it was about teaching them how to think, how to approach the game with the same intensity and commitment he had. He shared stories of his own struggles, of the lessons he had learned from moments of failure, like the coin toss. These stories were his way of connecting with the next generation of athletes and showing them that greatness wasn't just about talent, it was about resilience, work ethic, and the ability to rise after setbacks. At the same time, Michael's relationship with his family continued to deepen. He had always been a dedicated father, but the years after his playing career allowed him to be more present in his children's lives. He began to understand the importance of balance, of being there for his family without the constant pressure of being Michael Jordan, the basketball icon. His children had grown older, and Michael made a point of being involved in their lives in ways he hadn't been able to during his playing days. He took them to games, to business meetings, and to community events. He wanted them to understand the value of hard work, of dedication, and of giving back. As his children grew older, Michael found himself reflecting more on the kind of man he wanted them to become. His own father had been a guiding influence throughout his life, teaching him the importance of humility and the value of family. Michael wanted to pass those same lessons on to his own children. They had seen their father's greatness from a distance, but now he wanted them to understand the sacrifices he had made, the challenges he had faced, and the way he had overcome adversity. It was in these moments, sitting with his family, talking about his past, sharing the lessons he had learned, that Michael began to truly appreciate the depth of his legacy. He had always defined himself by his accomplishments, but now, as he looked at his children and his community, he saw that his legacy was about more than just basketball. It was about the people he had inspired, the lives he had touched, and the example he had set for others. The media's obsession with his past success never went away, but Michael had long since stopped caring about the narrative others wanted to create for him. The world had seen his triumphs, his championships, his unforgettable moments on the court. But Michael had come to realize that the real story of his life wasn't in the records, the accolades, or the glory. It was in the quiet moments of reflection, the personal relationships he had built, and the work he was doing behind the scenes to ensure the next generation had the same opportunities he did. One of the things that had always driven Michael was the idea of being the best. He had set himself apart by pushing past every limit, by working harder than anyone else. That was still a core part of his identity, but as he moved forward, he began to see that being the best wasn't just about beating the competition. It was about creating something that could outlast him. It was about building a legacy that would continue to inspire long after he was gone. This mindset carried over into his philanthropic work. Michael had always given back, but now, he found himself more involved than ever. He focused on education, mentorship, and community building, projects that had a lasting impact. Through his foundation, he provided scholarships for young athletes, helped fund youth programs, and supported initiatives aimed at giving kids from underprivileged backgrounds the chance to succeed. The $100,000 coin toss remained an interesting footnote in Michael's life, a moment that the world found fascinating but that Michael viewed as a small blip in a much larger journey. It wasn't the loss that mattered, but how he had responded to it. He had shown the world that he wasn't afraid to embrace failure, to own it, and to move forward with dignity. The coin flip had reminded him of the unpredictability of life and the importance of being grounded, of remaining true to oneself even when things didn't go according to plan. As Michael looked back on his career, he saw that his journey wasn't just about the championships or the accolades. It was about the people he had met, the lessons he had learned, and the impact he had made. And while he would always be remembered as one of the greatest basketball players of all time, the true measure of his legacy would be in the way he had used his platform to influence others, to shape the future, and to teach the next generation that success was built not just on talent, but on character. The coin toss in Las Vegas may have been a small moment in his life, but it was one that had taught him a valuable lesson, that life was unpredictable, and that sometimes the best way to face the unknown was with grace, humility, and a determination to keep moving forward. Michael Jordan had spent his entire life striving for greatness, but in this moment, he learned that greatness wasn't just about winning, it was about how you responded when you didn't. And that was a lesson he would carry with him forever. The years after the Las Vegas coin toss loss saw a shift in Michael Jordan's focus, not just in his career but in the way he viewed the world around him. While the media was quick to latch on to any narrative about his fall from grace, Michael quietly went about building a new legacy, one that wasn't just about basketball, but about mentorship, business, and community. He had learned long ago that success wasn't just measured by championships and accolades. Now, as a businessman and father, Michael's life was about balance, something that, in his younger years, had been hard to come by. Though he remained the face of his iconic Air Jordan brand, Michael had begun to see that his greatest impact would not come from his wealth or his fame, but from the people he could help, the young athletes he could guide, and the future generations he could inspire. With the Charlotte Hornets, he'd found a new role, one that allowed him to be an active part of shaping the game he loved, but also one that placed him at the center of the basketball community in a way that was different from when he was a player. No longer was it about just winning games. It was about creating an environment that encouraged growth, development, and long-term success. One of the biggest changes in Michael's life was his approach to his role as a father. In his playing days, he had sacrificed time with his family for his commitment to being the best basketball player in the world. His children had grown up seeing him as a superstar, but his time away from them had been significant. Now, with the demands of his business ventures and ownership of the Hornets, Michael found a new appreciation for family. He worked hard to carve out moments in his schedule for his children, to make sure they knew that, while he was still a driven man, he was also present. It wasn't just about being physically present, it was about showing his children what mattered beyond the fame. He took them to charity events, where they could see firsthand the impact of giving back to the community. Michael knew that his wealth and success could be used to improve the lives of others, and he wanted his children to understand that. It was no longer about the glory of winning or the accumulation of wealth, it was about using those resources to leave a lasting, positive mark on the world. His children were growing up in a different environment, one where they could see their father's influence extend far beyond basketball. This shift in perspective didn't just affect his family life, it also transformed his approach to business. His investments in various ventures, from his stake in the Charlotte Hornets to his continued success with Nike and the Jordan brand, were no longer about increasing his wealth. They were about sustainability, longevity, and ensuring that his impact on the world would last long after he was gone. Michael understood that the world of business had its own set of rules, but the principles of hard work, dedication, and authenticity that had served him on the court applied just as much to the business world. The $100,000 bet that had once seemed like a significant loss had come to represent something far more meaningful in Michael's life. It was a reminder that life didn't always go as planned. As a basketball player, he had been able to control most aspects of the game. He had always been able to dictate the flow of the game, to bend situations in his favor with his sheer will and skill. But in real life, things were far more unpredictable. The coin toss had humbled him, made him realize that there were some things outside of his control. But Michael didn't see that as a weakness. He saw it as an opportunity. The coin toss had shown him the value of resilience. It was easy to be a winner when you were always on top, but how you responded when things didn't go your way, that was what defined you. Michael had faced challenges in his career before, being cut from his high school team, coming back from retirement, dealing with injuries, but the coin toss had been something else entirely. It had forced him to confront the fact that, no matter how much you prepare, life would throw curveballs at you. In the years following that night in Las Vegas, Michael began to find a new peace with himself. He had done it all, broken records, won championships, built an empire. But the one thing he hadn't yet done was to find true fulfillment beyond the game of basketball. The $100,000 loss had been a reminder that life wasn't just about conquering every challenge. It was about how you approached those challenges with grace, humility, and a long-term vision. Michael's involvement with the Charlotte Hornets reflected this change. He was no longer just a former player looking to relive his glory days. He was now a mentor, an owner who could teach young athletes not only about basketball but about life. He didn't expect them to mirror his own career. Instead, he focused on helping them find their own path to success. He invested time in player development, offering guidance and mentorship, teaching them to be strong leaders, on and off the court. And it wasn't just the players who were impacted by his mentorship. The Hornets organization began to shift under his leadership. He instilled in everyone, coaches, front office staff, players, the idea that success was built on collaboration, on mutual respect, and on creating an environment where everyone could thrive. It wasn't about his name or his legacy, it was about building a foundation that would last. In many ways, Michael Jordan had become a student of the game again, not through playing, but through shaping the future of basketball. His charitable work continued to grow as well. Michael had always been involved in philanthropy, but now he was more hands-on than ever before. He had always given back in various ways, donating money to various causes, helping families in need, and supporting youth programs, but the loss had inspired him to do more. He became more actively involved in his foundations, visiting the communities that benefited from his donations, speaking with the young people who had been impacted by his efforts. He wanted to show them that success wasn't just about getting rich or famous. It was about using your resources, whatever they were, to lift others up. This new perspective was reflected in his personal life as well. His relationships with friends, family, and business partners became more authentic. The walls that had once existed between him and others began to fall away. Michael was no longer the untouchable icon. He was a man who had lived through struggles, who had faced adversity, and who now understood the value of human connection. His interactions with people, whether in business or personal settings, were more genuine, more rooted in the understanding that everyone was dealing with their own battles. Michael still held onto the traits that made him great, his drive, his focus, his relentless pursuit of excellence. But now, those traits were tempered by a wisdom that only came from experiencing the highs and lows of life. He had learned that greatness wasn't just about accumulating achievements or wealth. It was about how you handled the inevitable failures, how you used your experiences to inspire others, and how you gave back to the world that had helped shape you. The $100,000 coin toss would always be a part of his story. It would be a reminder that life was unpredictable, that even the greatest athletes could face defeat in the most unexpected ways. But it was also a reminder of how far Michael had come, how he had learned to embrace life's uncertainties, and how he had used those lessons to build a legacy that went beyond the basketball court. For Michael Jordan, true greatness wasn't just about winning. It was about showing up, time and time again, no matter the odds. And it was about doing it with integrity, with grace, and with a commitment to leaving the world better than he found it. The coin toss in Las Vegas remained an unusual chapter in Michael Jordan's life. It wasn't the kind of thing that most people would have expected to be associated with a figure like him. The loss was, on its own, trivial, a momentary blip on the radar of a man who had defined success in ways that others could only dream of. Yet, for Michael, it represented something deeper. It served as an unexpected wake-up call. It made him think not just about the game of basketball, but about how to live his life after the game, in a way that wasn't confined by the rigid expectations placed on him. Years had passed since that night in Las Vegas. Michael had, as expected, moved on. The coin toss wasn't something that occupied his thoughts regularly. It didn't overshadow his legacy, it didn't define him. But the lessons learned from that brief, seemingly insignificant moment stuck with him. The true test of a person's character, he had come to realize, wasn't in the moments of glory. It was how they handled the moments that didn't go their way. The way they responded to defeat, and how they picked themselves up and kept going. At first, when he had handed over the $100,000 with no complaints, Michael had believed it was simply the right thing to do. He made the bet, and he had lost. That was the end of the story. But in the days, weeks, and months that followed, Michael reflected on the deeper meaning of that simple act. For the first time, he had truly experienced the randomness of life, the unpredictability of the world around him. He had spent so many years controlling the game on the court, commanding the narrative of his success. But the coin flip had humbled him, reminding him that there were forces beyond his control, forces that could not be influenced by willpower or preparation. That realization made him think differently about everything else in his life. If a man who had conquered the basketball world could lose in such a random way, what did that mean for the other parts of his life? How could he build something lasting and meaningful if everything was so fragile? He knew that there were no guarantees, that even the most careful plans could be derailed by chance. But he also knew that, for all its randomness, life was about what you made of those moments of uncertainty. How you responded to life's curveballs was what defined you. In the years that followed the coin toss, Michael continued to evolve. While he was still deeply involved in his business empire, he found new purpose in his role as the owner of the Charlotte Hornets. This wasn't just about basketball anymore. It wasn't about legacy in the way that most people expected. It was about creating something that would last, something that could stand on its own merits long after he was gone. He had a passion for the game, but his passion for creating something sustainable and impactful became the driving force behind his decisions. The Hornets weren't a championship-caliber team at the time he took ownership, but Michael didn't mind. He wasn't in it for the immediate rewards. He was in it for the long haul. For years, his focus had been on his personal success, but now he saw that his influence could be used to help shape the future of the game. He invested time in developing young talent, not just in their basketball skills, but in their approach to life. He became a mentor, not just a businessman or a former player. The lesson of the coin toss, a lesson in humility, shaped how he interacted with the team. He wanted them to understand that greatness wasn't just about winning titles. It was about the journey, the process, and learning from every experience, both good and bad. Michael's approach to the Hornets was less about the wins and losses and more about the foundation he was building for the future. The environment he created wasn't one driven by constant pressure to perform, but by a commitment to growth and learning. The focus shifted from the expectation of immediate success to the importance of long-term success, building a team that would stand the test of time. It was about creating a culture, not just a roster of players. At the same time, Michael's relationship with his family deepened. As his children grew older, he made more of an effort to spend time with them, to be present in their lives in a way he had not always been able to during his playing career. The sacrifices he had made for his career had been necessary, but now, in his second act, he found himself more engaged than ever. He spent weekends with his kids, not just as a father, but as a teacher, sharing the lessons he had learned over the years, about hard work, about resilience, and about dealing with life's uncertainties. Through his philanthropic work, Michael also found a sense of fulfillment that went beyond basketball. His charitable foundation, which had long been focused on education and opportunity for underserved youth, took on new significance. He became more personally involved, not just writing checks but visiting schools, meeting with students, and making sure that the resources he provided were being used effectively. The money and the fame had opened doors, but it was his personal involvement that made the biggest difference. He knew that he had the ability to change lives, and he was determined to use his platform for good. The coin toss was no longer a topic of conversation. People had long since moved on to the next big story, the next controversy, the next sporting event. But for Michael, it remained a turning point, a small moment in time that had reminded him of the unpredictability of life and the importance of humility. He had once defined himself by his ability to control every aspect of his success. Now, he defined himself by how he embraced the uncertainty and built something that would last. As Michael looked back over the years, he realized that the coin toss, in its simplicity, had shaped him in ways he hadn't anticipated. It had reminded him that failure wasn't the end of the story, it was part of it. How you responded to failure was just as important as how you responded to success. In fact, it was often more important. He had been pushed to the limits of his own expectations, and he had come to understand that the true measure of his legacy would be how he dealt with life's ups and downs. In the end, Michael Jordan's story wasn't just about basketball. It wasn't just about winning championships, setting records, or creating an empire. It was about resilience. It was about learning that, even when life didn't go as planned, there was always another opportunity to grow, to improve, and to make a difference. The coin toss in Las Vegas had been a small moment in the grand scheme of his life, but it had helped him understand the bigger picture. Life was a series of moments, and how you handled them, good and bad, was what mattered most. Michael's legacy, ultimately, was not defined by his championships or the accolades. It was defined by the man he became, the one who faced life with humility, grace, and the determination to use his success to uplift others. And in that, the story of the coin toss, though small, became a testament to the power of resilience and the enduring strength of character. The years had passed, and the events of the Las Vegas coin toss had slowly faded into the background of Michael Jordan's larger-than-life legacy. To the world, Michael was still the basketball legend, the six-time NBA champion, the Hall of Famer who had redefined the game. His name had become synonymous with greatness, and his Air Jordan brand had become a global icon. Yet, behind the scenes, Michael had undergone a quiet transformation. The loss of that $100,000 had been a catalyst for something deeper within him, a realization that life was not just about victories, championships, or accolades. It was about how you handled the losses, how you adapted to change, and how you used your experiences to build something lasting. Michael Jordan, the player, the businessman, the father, was no longer defined solely by the relentless pursuit of perfection. His career had always been about pushing himself beyond his limits, breaking records, and achieving what seemed impossible. But as he moved into the next chapter of his life, he found that true success wasn't just about being the best. It was about finding peace, embracing the uncertainties of life, and passing on the lessons he had learned to those who followed him. The coin toss had been a humbling experience, one that Michael had never expected. It was a reminder that, despite all the preparation, despite all the work, life could still throw curveballs that were completely out of his control. But in the weeks and months that followed, he came to understand that those moments of unpredictability were a part of the journey. They didn't define him, they were simply challenges to overcome, just like the ones he faced on the basketball court. For Michael, the true test had always been how he responded. When he lost the bet, he didn't sulk or try to justify the outcome. He accepted it. He showed the world that even the greatest players in history could lose, could face failure, and still carry on with dignity. That, perhaps more than anything, was what had made Michael Jordan's legacy so powerful. He wasn't just a player who could win at all costs, he was a man who could face defeat, learn from it, and keep moving forward. As the years continued to roll by, Michael found more and more peace in this mindset. His involvement with the Charlotte Hornets, his business ventures, and his philanthropic work allowed him to shape his legacy in new ways. But it was his family that remained his anchor. The love and support of his children, his friends, and his loved ones became his greatest source of strength. The quiet moments with his family, the conversations, the shared laughter, these were the moments that truly mattered to Michael now. He had spent so many years focused on basketball, on winning, on being the best, but now he understood the importance of balance. He understood that life wasn't just about the destination, it was about the journey and the people you shared it with. As Michael looked back on his journey, the coin toss seemed almost insignificant. It had been a moment in time, a small event in the grand scheme of his life. But it had taught him something valuable. It had shown him that even when things didn't go according to plan, even when life threw him a curveball, he could still stand tall. He had learned to embrace the uncertainty, to find strength in the unpredictable, and to accept that some things were simply out of his control. Michael's relationship with the media also shifted over time. He had spent years cultivating a public persona that was untouchable, always the victor, always in control. But after the coin toss, he became more open with the press, more willing to share his thoughts on life and the lessons he had learned. His vulnerability became a source of inspiration to many, especially to those who had grown up idolizing him. They saw that Michael Jordan wasn't just a superhero, he was a human being, someone who faced the same challenges, the same uncertainties, as anyone else. And yet, he had managed to rise above them, not because of his talent alone, but because of his resilience and his ability to learn from every experience. Michael continued to support the Hornets, working tirelessly to improve the team and to build a legacy in basketball that wasn't just about individual accolades. He wanted the team to stand on its own, to create its own history, to build a foundation that would outlast him. The players who came through the Hornets system under his leadership carried with them the lessons he had imparted, lessons about perseverance, about embracing failure, about always striving to be better. But perhaps the most important legacy Michael left was the one he built outside of basketball, the impact he made on the lives of young people, the communities he helped uplift, and the opportunities he provided to those who had none. His philanthropic efforts became one of his greatest sources of pride. He had always understood the power of giving back, but now, as he looked back on his career, he saw that the impact he had made in these areas would far outlast the trophies, the championships, and the records. Michael's foundation supported countless children, providing them with the resources to succeed in life, just as he had been given those same opportunities growing up. He understood the importance of education, of mentorship, and of providing young people with the tools they needed to succeed, not just in sports, but in life. His involvement in his community became just as important as his business ventures or his work with the Hornets. For Michael, leaving a legacy meant giving others the chance to succeed, to build their own futures, just as he had. As Michael's life entered this new phase, the coin toss, and the lessons it had taught him, seemed to fade into the background. It was still a part of his story, but it was no longer something that defined him. What defined him now was the way he had handled every part of his journey, the wins, the losses, the highs, the lows. It was about how he had risen every time life knocked him down. It was about how he had used his success to help others and how he had become a mentor, not just a player, to the next generation. In the end, Michael Jordan's legacy wasn't just about basketball. It was about resilience, about how you handle failure, and about how you use your position in life to make a difference. The story of the coin toss, once a defining moment of defeat, became a symbol of his strength. It was a reminder that, even in the face of loss, there is opportunity for growth, for learning, and for creating something that lasts. Michael had built a life that would endure, not because he was the greatest player to ever play the game, but because he had become the greatest version of himself. A man who embraced the unpredictable and used it to fuel his ongoing journey.